Hello everyone, today we talk about Basil II's expansionism and especially the costs benefits of this and how, broadly speaking, the military conquests were affecting or paralleling other political and social changes. We made a video about Basil II in outline for our Byzantine history series slash playlist, and we will surely talk about him more, concretely, not on other occasions, both in general and in detail. So today's video is, relatively new. Rarely do these things, but it's a bit of not much of a comparison Basil's reign with one of other emperors, but rather observing as I often stressed, however, also elsewhere, the complexity of sorting out correctly, let's say, the Byzantine history for what we can know, for many reasons. There are mostly exquisitely historical, that is, what the hell do we actually know about what the things that were happening there. These realities were way less, let's say, productive in terms of actual critical sources than other areas, especially perhaps mostly Western-centric in a narrow sense. But objectively, what the autocratic character of the Byzantine Empire brought to on the long run, and how there is all a specific attitude and method and perspective we have to read Roman sources from at this point. And I was reading today about Basil's campaigns, and reading here and there, especially about the Balkan ones against the Bulgarians, for example. You're talking about expeditions that are quite successful on the longer run, the crushing of the First Bulgarian Empire, and etc., the expansion on the Caucasus. Also the aborted Sicilian campaign because of Saint Basil's death, right? The wars against the Fatimids. And that is all something that goes in parallel with objectively a positive expansion, a successful one that also dates back to during the other 10th century emperors' achievements, the reconquest of Crete, of Cyprus, etc. Have created essentially a new world, right? Have brought the Roman Empire to this incredible boundaries that, Basil's dominions, basically his death, were half as large again as those of Constantine the Seventh in the mid-10th century. So Basil was a colossus as an individual, as a commander, as a ruler, but at the same time there is all a broader historiographical question that we addressed somewhere, that is, but was he really, rowing forward in terms of what eventually the empire would have transformed like, and were certain changes, especially in terms of gradual privatization, let's say unavoidable in part, but also really negative in practice for imperial rule. You see, Basil II, I like the historical figure, but I think that sometimes it's a bit too passively read as, the greatest guy ever did the greatest thing ever. Indeed, probably surely one of the greatest Roman emperors. Some say even the greatest. And especially during speaking of properly the Byzantine, so-called Byzantine part of Roman history, but would have it not been, let's say, more convenient for the empire to eventually, keeping to privatize, and with an imperial control though still in place, like it would eventually be sanctioned in a way or another under the Komnenian dynasty and the crisis of say the mid 11th century that the empire faced, and that kind of disgregated in part the same achievements of Basil II, right? This is indeed a very important question, because the idea that the survival of a middle class order in a way, unspoiled, unthreatened by the subjection to the great landowners, and therefore the continuation through this of a more centralized, statal, and kind of individually meritocratically based imperial saddle power is debatable, right? It might have not been. It's not a matter of whether Basil did good or not. Probably he did for his own times, but surely what he did still had a gigantic impact on the speed and the dynamics that would have come later. And we will try to understand this, because when we talk about these polities as any other, we try to read them often and actually always in a Clausewitzian sense whenever we can, and we have never to forget the complexity of these realities, and especially the difficulties of rulers to actually govern, right? Which doesn't simply say, okay, here the emperor was in charge, all the empire depended on him. No polity at the time had a ruler that actually controlled its own polity, right? It was just a sort of equilibristic gamble on how to invest, basically, in the next move that would maintain your rule for a bit longer and try not to make the system collapse in the meanwhile, and often using some of the most ruthless means to maintain it. And Basil, I'm not against ruthless means as long as they bring some benefits. Basil surely was a great employer of that, but at the same time, his success probably overshadowed the possibility that we're looking at the history of a sovereign that was still maintaining essentially his own power, and not necessarily was in that sense acting in concerto, we could say, with the rest of all the elements of society, which is always the case in a way or another. But if the problem sometimes is maintaining control over a single system, we have to understand how it's probably achieved, and what at the end of the day this can be attributed to a contingential necessity, and or how this eventually went in tandem with a political and social development with the same trend, with the same direction. It may sound kind of a foggy problem, but it's really not in a way. Basil was naturally coming also from this 10th century. We had seen these great figures we mentioned before, like Constantine VII, who, for example, had a little interest in expansion. He was embodying a bit the sovereign educator, right? Man of great learning. This was being paralleled also in other countries. The same Bulgarian ruler Simeon was stressing something like that. Like his father Leo VI, he was emphasizing the imperial role, the emperor's role as the one of wise guarantor and of order and justice, right? Basil, as you know, was as we've already seen in other videos, was a very eccentric figure for Byzantine ruling standards. He was emerging from this difficult situation. I mean, he met definitely with the rebellions. His ascent to the throne was recovered because of his lineage, but had been at the beginning controlled by someone else. The eventual wars that he had to face were pretty demanding. I mean, the same one with Bulgaria. I mean, for 10 years, basically, the Byzantines campaign in the Balkans without any major victory, which is a long term. And some historians have come to actually question even the effectiveness of the imperial measures at that point. And, observe, and not just because the Bulgarians were defeated in the end, they didn't do well, and they didn't also strain their own resources in the process, because for 10 years there was no major, reversal of the situation. In fact, here we're talking also about costs, right? Never forget, when you talk about these realities in this specific time in history, the enormous impact that not just the military expenses in in absolute terms are required just by themselves, but how was the system able to sustain them, and what possibility was there to eventually replenish these over time. And the costs of expansion in any of these situations, in any policy at this point, were enormous, right? The goal was to essentially make a gigantic effort to try to recover certain provincial realities, so that eventually and hopefully in case of victory, that all that investment had not gone lost, and these lands could in the following generations provide for enough surplus altogether to scrap together for maybe other expansion or defense, right? So in a world that was very unpredictable, right, and the intrinsic fragility of political and social structures is actually pretty evident. In fact, expansion, as we'll see now, didn't bring necessarily to problem solving, right? Because expansion also means that if society becomes richer and local politics takes advantage of that, you need to cope with new elites, right? That in this sense weren't much developing in the sense of preservation of middle class, as sometimes stressed, nor the state here, the tax lands were actually different, behaving in a different way concretely, right? So the privatization of the system, eventually the establishment of the paranoia here, was something that was in the first place why Basil previously to that had tried to counter, but we have to read also in the sense of what were his means anyway, right? And also what could be done to prevent this further privatization. So Basil, for sure, is a military emperor, right? His prime aim was the one of conquest, right? And there was a deep political necessity for this, because he, through the control of the army in person and becoming a sort of patron father for it, was ousting the previous ruling class that was also the military class that is the one that we're talking about specific families, prominent nobiliary families that he had also relied on in the first phase of his reign, and also with the various problems and rebellions and schemes, etc., that he wanted to prevent, right? And he invested all his life in this, right? He was, said to have been to have read a few, to have dedicated himself just mostly to a Spartan way of life, and at many levels. And another problem that this led to, for example, was that Basil never actually appointed a heir, right? And considering also he was ruling up to a certain point with his younger brother Constantine. But this is an aspect that is also understandable in a way, because what he had accomplished at that point in his reign was very, in fact, devoid of he was based mostly on his personality, on his figure and his character, and a succession would have entailed a very different work from the one he engaged himself constantly throughout all his reign. It was basically always on campaign. But surely there were pros in this. He was able to maintain the army's loyalty by rewarding these men with means, say, licit and illicit. Simply, I leave you the criterion to judge this, and by becoming properly the constant commander-in-chief, something that he had somewhat in common with his predecessor Nicephorus II Phocas family. And he, Basil, was consciously, actively, openly contending with the prestige of the great military families and other individuals that still had that kind of control. So because of their private clienteles, in spite of the attempts of the imperial system to to actually create in fact, a more central army, properly a Constantinopolitan army that could counter the ones of the themes of the provinces that were still, in fact, in place during Basil's time, and that especially the ones of Asia Minor, the southeastern frontier, were very important and the most relevant also politically in the empire. Basil tended, in fact, to also commit, to oblige, to compel some families and other local communities to participate to this effort, so that he could fundamentally acquire more weight also locally, because militarily speaking, that is the problem. You have to make these people spending their own resources for such massive military effort. You can't just rely on the central government. That can be the base on which you can impose your own authority on the periphery. But then you have also, in the sense, to turn towards internally against certain elements of the same Byzantine society that at this point had their lands confiscated. They considered that the organization of the empire was pretty messed up at many levels, as we'll see in a while, meaning that there were lots of debates, for example, especially on jurisdiction. That is, who did have the right to collect taxes and in the name of whom and where. And the empire was very composite, and things also different levels of productivity, of wealth, etc. So things were very delicate in that sense. There was no really a unitary direction. Naturally, sources, and this is the main narrative, stress the fact that Basil was stripping or purchasing at some point the lands from the powerful to the poor, and that the malefactors were fundamentally had been the members of the Malenos and the Phocases families in general. So this is naturally the product of Basil's political propaganda of the time. Parts of we got this idea these main families had stripped the peasantry, the free peasantry, of their own possessions. They were bad. They were essentially eroding the statal public base. Behind this, there is a very different reality we will see in a while, because it is true, of course, that the most powerful extended their control, also, without much of a legal control, with violence, blackmail, imposition, threats, and so on. But this is, first of all, basically what was happening pretty much everywhere, and the same Basil was doing the same thing, with these other people. Not necessarily the nobility would actually do this in a violent form. That is, like a bit like in the West, right? The peasantry was seeking often, spontaneously protection, right? Especially in a reality like the Byzantine Empire that was notoriously also tormented by this constant frontier threats, etc. So we don't have here to explain, but we have a pretty hefty Byzantine history playlist. But I mean, all the differences that existed politically, socially, economically between the internal coastal urbanized areas and the hinterland peasant rural ones, etc. The various threats, the character of the frontiers, etc. So the peasants on statal land didn't live much better practice than the one on private land, held land. It was mostly a clash between whose the right was to do what, to control what in that level. And surely the center had the public authority had all the interest to stress such prerogatives, as long, especially as the public was still embodied by imperial authority itself. So otherwise, this is basically what all these people did, and this happens in other countries. Like, who doesn't have power always complains about who's ruling, then does the same exact thing to come to rule, and when it rules, right? And and then the others go down and start complaining as before the others were doing. And so the ideology switches, but at the end of the day, they're the same identical thing. So this idea of the middle class that had to be preserved, it's a bit of a romantic myth. It wasn't happening truly like that. There were surely areas that had used to, to have more privileged connection with the public that, were freer, that were surely being eroded in this. But the broader dynamics were intertwined with so many other factors that in practice it wasn't about really preserving those guys' freedom that moved such imperial policy. Also, there is to consider that the army itself at this point was composed by many elements that, as we've seen, Basil had compelled to join, to participate. So there are certain chronicles that stress, for example, as the Armenian Aristarchus Lastivert, that quote, many of those who were in the camp had walked with their feet behind the emperor, but in thought and words they were behind the rebels, right? Because of the coup specifically that was attempted during Basil's last Caucasian campaign. And this also can be explained not just because of the natural political instability that the states could have, but practically because of the same effort, the same strains that were put on the community at large, right, by such huge enterprises. And that would have been normal. I mean, the idea of a betrayal, somebody plotting behind, back, let's be honest, is stereotypically kind of at least passed down to history with the name of Byzantine, right? It was happening everywhere, but these constant plots, in a way, were more paradigmatic in this reality because exactly because it was more unitary. Exactly because it was one guy ruling versus all the others, right? Because of the autocratic nature of the empire. So it's more evident, but it's not that it was done necessarily more or less than in other countries. The Michael Psellos arrives to state that Basil was treating his subjects as if he had subjugated them, right? So this is also probably objective in the measure in which, as we've seen, the sheer cost, absolute cost of military campaigns was surely pressuring society as a whole. And indeed, Basil II had bent this major families of the empire were in charge, at the end of the day, still part of the Constantinopolitan nobility, because to obey, you have to understand here that Constantinople still hosted all these families that had major estates in the provinces, right? Also, the emperors would develop, in Komnenian times, Crete was simply, the imperial, the Komnenian garden, right? It was their private property, nobody could touch it. So it was always the capital and the province together, right? And by curbing these prominent families, he was curbing important parts of the empire and squeezing them, to weaken their power in favor of the Aristotle-held ones, or at least the ones on which Basil counted, as we'll see, not just properly the Byzantine ones, but also, could say, foreign in a way. In fact, Basil's military capacities have to be read in this proper capability of curbing the most important properties to his own will, right? To draw resources from. And this was done through threat, meaning that the same army fed itself of these extortions. So that was a big deal. And here, command leadership was fundamental, because he had to struggle through, his reign, also these events, these rebellions. The only authority that opposed openly the emperor couldn't be quite, taken out with the same means was the Patriarchy of Constantinople, right? Together with other senior churchmen and monks that were lamenting this great expenses and the and tax pressure. In fact, the same Basil at some point promised the Patriarch Sergius II that he would lift such obligations had he prevailed in the war against the Bulgarians. And at the same time, as we were saying before, Basil was relying on certain non-properly Byzantine elements of society, and specifically the non-Greek and non-Chalcedonian subjects that, as always in these pre-industrial realities, were often, as the minorities, or at least in the eccentric elements to the establishment, the ones that could counterbalance the most powerful internal figures, and the multi-ethnicity of the empire had always played like that, right? The more external elements I draw into the system as a ruler, and the more these people are actually relying on me, on my authority, my central power against the autochthonous, the indigenous element, that instead always tries to strip away power. And this was a mean, especially to boost, in fact, a process of statalization in many countries, right? This was happening in the same time. I don't know, look at Hungary, for example. They were drawing lots of Western elements at some point to counter the ethnic Magyar nobility. It's not random, because at this point, think about the Varangian Guard. Think about properly also the typology of the army that was being built at this point, with certain units, certain corpses that were properly could have not been fielded if not by the state. Look at cataphracts in the heaviest sense, the Klibanov, so this system was still naturally strong, more centralized than basically most powers out there. Right, in Europe, basically just Constantinople, the Caliphate accord, but it, however, was about now to dissolve, and in Mediterranean, just the Caliphate and Sultanate were something centralized according to the older statal models of Roman Hellenistic tradition. The rest of Europe was feudalizing heavily, and all these. Let's say it was also expanding, though, in a way that these other powers would often seize certain elements from the outside. Here, however, we're talking mostly about, for example, the Armenians, in part the same Bulgarians were subjugated. And these peoples would provide soldiers that were not less effective or less loyal than the Greek troops. Let's say this idea that was bought or compelled faith is less reliable is really not real, right? It's a 19th century myth. The fact that mercenaries are basically some disgusting human beings, but they very often they are the best troops in absolute terms, and in any case, even the best, let's say, statal ones are such only if they are actually paid. So. This diversity added to Basil's advantage, so that all the elements of power and imperial harmony could, maintain cohesion of the state. And in fact, he rewarded eventually some elements, foreign elements of the army, with lands and forts to, for example, eminent Armenian expatriates. That is also a measure naturally to buy people from the other side. That is to say, look at how the opportunities that I give you, so that you don't have to be so enemy to me, and we can intertwine our business. Basil, famously enough, also, for example, was responsible for the settlement of Armenians in Cilicia. This repopulation policies were also quite important from an economical, demographical point of view. So the expansion under Basil was not ruinous in itself, meaning that this enormous military fortitude we have seen surely put under strain many areas, but still didn't cause a major crack, right? And historically speaking, this would be sensed politically, like with a thermometer. We are used to complain that Justinian overexpanded the empire and then it collapsed. Then, well, there was a freaking pandemic in the middle, and with a dramatic effect. And what they were doing was essentially right. Here, things went the way they had, and also the outcome of the campaigns was fundamentally positive. Bulgarians for example, were brought to serve on the Eastern Front, so managed to be subjugated, to be employed on the opposite imperial frontier. In fact, conversely, the Armenians fought in Basil's Bulgarian wars. And there were differences between these two countries. Bulgaria was mostly agrarian, while the Armenian towns and smaller settlements were important for revenue, for cash mostly. They were two very different societies. And in fact, the emperor was very careful about Western Armenian borderlands, because here there were many prosperous towns that had already attracted the interest of Constantine VII. And during the 11th century, there was a broader revival of economy all over Eurasia. So these centers were the fulcrum, the cradle of important trade activities. Also, other areas were still flourishing. For example, Cappadocia, so continental Anatolia, was one former Byzantine border zone. At this point, presents beautiful works, artistical production. Think about the rock chapels and monasteries that they date fundamentally from these years, and also more distantly, in a very strategically relevant area, it would be very important as a route of expansion, and saying would bring eventually in half a century to the same expansion in Armenia and theoretically to Mesopotamia. Then Manzikert arrived, right, and things went lost. But there were numerous churches and monasteries erected by Syriac Jacobite immigrants in the Euphrates Valley, right, and these were communities that, in part, not deterministically, but they were fundamentally communities the empire could rely on, also on external, on the periphery, and also south from Mediterranean parts of Cilicia. They attest their wealth and faith. So these were communities definitely the Byzantines could rely on. Also, Antioch, that at this time was literally curatoria of the emperor, so that he would have this privileged supervision, control, seems to have prospered. These were, definitely, this was the frontier, but still major, urban. Antioch is a major urban center, and the key for Syria, and in the connected to the Mediterranean, the Silk Road, etc. So this was something that, as you know, would always, the Byzantines would be always in attempt to control and to recover when lost, eventually being seized by the Crusades, but always, in these ambiguous terms with Constantinople that claimed sovereignty. And here, Armenians would be settled first probably as soldiers, but later as craftsmen and traders too by Basil. This increasing population and economical transition was seen to, as a positive dynamic for imperial government, especially in terms of revenues. But the army's enlargement was a different thing, because here we don't even know, historically speaking, how much was Basil's army properly restructured, working compared to our previous times, because we don't have the sources that can tell us minimally what the cost of the army was at the time. Surely we know that the Byzantine army under Basil II was substantially larger than what it had been during the first half of the 10th century, and especially it was much more professional in nature, because it was depending ever more on money, on pay, rather than a local resources. This is typical, especially in such urbanized and commercially active areas like the ones in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this would be very important, as you understand, to in a political sense, because the communities that produced money proper were the freer ones, the least stratified, so the ones that the more autonomous one from controlled great landowners that relied mostly on the rural world, albeit these were always connected. So such money would be useful for Basil to deterritorialize his military assets and to simply pay its army independently on territorial allegiance, or at least relying on this more florid centers in theory. Naturally, this was all connected to the interconnection of the empire, right? Because it depends, for example, with the trade routes passed. At this time, for example, Anatolia was still naturally in Byzantine hands fully, and the internal traffics were crucial for the development of the same cities that would remain more faithful the more they were tied to interland production than trying, as it would happen after Manzikert, for example, try to a bit more maritime in nature, and therefore escaping a sort of centrifugal force from the same imperial control. But the important here is the professionalism of the army, right? That you can pay regularly, or at least with properly a greater attraction than simply forcing local levies to join, and wherever the money are, the better men. And under Basil's reign, war campaigning was ceaseless. Also, there was the problem of maintaining substantial garrisons in major centers such as Dyrrhachium and Sirmium on the Epirus and Danubian frontier. So at this time, probably the administrative apparatus of the empire was responsible to upkeep such troops was not that different from the one that had operated before, right? Reason for which probably the same Basil, that surely accumulated a lot of money in the same imperial palace, was probably in this bigger scale of management, kind of acting a bit on as a lord in his own regard, rather than being so over reliant on the state administration. The important aspect of this is, as we were saying before, is that smaller armies existed throughout all the 10th century and beyond on a thematic base, especially in the provinces. The most fit, powerful provinces in this sense were the ones of the themes of Asia Minor that were a bit the backbone of the imperial military capacity in general. And however, the increasing prosperity of the empire, because of the general economical revival and the successful conquests now, was asking for a greater need of non-military officials that had to manage the new territories, the new wealth resources. And especially it was an important development of Greek and Asia Minor's western towns, essentially around the coastal plains, were the most developed, fertile, urbanized, and so on. That witnessed definitely the let's say a building development and more using monetary transactions. The towns at this point were growing in a way that they would form new elites. So these local landowners saw also more opportunities to enrich themselves, producing goods in the towns, and this surely would create more interconnected elites in a sense, but also, let's say, surely in this centers wealth was more equally distributed, but at the same time there was still a prevalence, let's say, preeminence of certain figures that would become ever more powerful and were more, inclined to carry out, let's say, to control the areas more as lords than civic servants. However, we don't have to believe that this increased, let's say, kinetic energy would lead to necessarily greater chaos, or that the emergence of new elites would be necessarily detrimental to central government policies, right? Exactly because the emergence of richer leaders, businessmen, lords, etc., could be used as, effectively by Constantinople for co-opting them, right? So the expensively equipped soldiers would be more easily salaried through, let's say, easier points of reference for supplies, right? These entrepreneurs could provide those resources in exchange for, promotion, right? Either locally or sometimes even in the administrative career, and therefore forming a kind of a new class, or at least something that could help counter the omnipower of the major families. This was happening timidly overall, right? But still was enough in the balance sometimes to benefit consistently an imperial policy. And surely, as we were saying at the beginning, there would be contrasts between, especially the military and civilian administrative apparatuses, on the jurisdictions and fiscal rights, because the administration had been fundamentally messed up. Certain provinces had been going on their own. They had different customs, traditions. The state was there, but it had declined its functioning in different ways according to Rizal. So in a moment of re-expansion of the empire, of imperial control, etc., this did cause some friction here and there, and this was very important because it was a conflict exactly over the revenues, of course. So what at the end of the day, the empire had interest to arrive, quickly without problems. So appointing officials, title holders, dignitaries, etc., at a local level was an important political move at the time of Basil to reduce trouble, to control better, to choose an appointee to make things work and to make it prevail in the local substratum, let's say, at a political and social level, and this would hopefully also reduce the conflict, given that imperial authority at that point would have been kind of an ultimate judge in the matter, but things weren't so easy, but still better than nothing. So it was a system of influences, of clientelage, as it had always been. And overall, the system wasn't functioning bad, right? Basil's the second reign was a success, in part also for this. And there was a care sometimes from the state to actually even provide charters to the major landowners, to essentially cash through them at the moment, but fundamentally freeing them through the same charters from the imperial demands, right? So that's also a mean that resembles what was happening in the West, right? I give you the recognition, the temporary recognition of a certain power, so that on the long run, I accept formally to renounce to the local revenue, but at the moment I win you over temporarily. And that could be paradoxically a better way to tie rather than to decentralize. And that's why also in the West, the vassalitic beneficiary system paradoxically had, also in spite of decentralization, that is also a relative term, but surely was more in the West than in the Byzantine Empire. It was an important gluing factor altogether from a political point of view, because all these, let's say, labyrinthine intertwinement at the end of the day was all aimed at, establishing a connection between central power and these communities. And at the same time, the state under Basil II was increasing the number of peasants working on its own domain, right? So also the state in the fiscal land was behaving like a great landowner and searching for more labor force, working force to put, land in production. So this was important because there was, broadly speaking, a demographic increase, not just because of the conquests that brought further subjects, slaves in, but properly because of an increased, an expansion was happening more or less all over the world at that point, and which would greatly benefit the state's tax rolls because, taxation is per capita. But in this background dynamics, still what really mattered was imperial power, imperial government, and the action of the major elites of the empire, the high ones of Constantinople. So there were certain systemic problems that Basil's reign didn't quite fix, and that would also in fact create problems on the long run, and that's where the debate we were hinting at the beginning, preservation of certain settled realities or further privatization. It's largely a relative question, but still here there were some threats specifically to the system in itself, because these ceaseless campaigning under Basil II still demanded an astonishing amount of resources, and the deal with Basil's reign is that he managed, let's say, to mask the problem in a way by assuming control of the army, so the armed force, violence, so that he could basically maintain a broader consensus on, at the level, essentially, literally of deterrence. The same Basil had, Michael Psellus tells us, had accumulated 200,000 gold pieces in his palace treasury. And this was done by essentially, literally, confiscating, by expoliating and cumulating treasury. And Basil had managed to do this because he was a great commander, an astonishing leader, that had literally married the army, right? But the reason why he had done this, aside from his personal inclinations and so on, in capacities, is that he was trying to put an end, at least as far he was personally concerned as an emperor, because others would act otherwise. This is exactly the point, because they didn't have the same capacities to essentially get rid of the problem of generals' revolts, right? The Byzantine army had witnessed that, and he knew better because he had also experienced it during his, his regency times, etc. This was kind of endemic at the time. So Basil thought, okay, I have this dramatic capacity. I will use it to enforce energically my own rule as an army commander. So I will strip generals from their actual control in trying to erode the power of these families. But other generals couldn't actually do that, right? Strong arm methods could be enforced at this point. Also, for example, because of his military success, because if it hadn't been because to that he would have simply lost, sometimes because of rebellions, but also in war, a defeat might have overthrown him. So it was always an equilibristic measure, and definitely other emperors didn't have the same military skills, nor had properly the specific interest, nor support to continue that kind of militaristic policy, and especially these brutal means to strip the most powerful families from power. So obviously at Basil's death, things changed naturally, but expansionism in itself, speaking of cost-benefits ratio, wasn't the answer. It couldn't be for too much. The empire could expand, but at some point had to be consolidated. That couldn't be done just by threatening violence to the major families or relying on new local elites that were, however, unavoidably falling into the under the influence of major landowners and other elements. So it was trying to empty the sea with a buckle, and the system worked as far as Basil's reign was concerned, but eventually, as we know, on the longer run, the trend was going somewhere else. And naturally, expansion and economical revival, etc., were rendering available new political forces that, even in there, couldn't simply be disciplined militarily speaking. Right? The military, as we've seen here, was also treacherous sometimes. In the same Basil's army, there would be traitors and plotters, etc. So it's perfectly normal. Why? Because that reflects politics in a society that doesn't quite like completely what is happening, and that can always strike at some point, or there is a risk of that happening, and therefore that balance couldn't be held forever, right? And it fundamentally wouldn't last, and not just because Basil died or his formula wasn't replicated by successors, but because systems change, and sometimes there is not really much you can do, and sometimes it's even better to follow a bit change in order to have at the moment to ride the wave at the moment, to address your plans with a certain amount of fresh force, let's say. Then eventually things will change again, because waves do not last forever. And so I don't know if I managed to render the idea, whether we will talk about Basil II again, definitely, but it's still important to see here the broader perspective, and also the internal one as well, because without that, it would sound as if just there was this cool ruler that conquered everybody, and it was cool, and then kids today like it because they played video games about the Byzantine Empire where he's the coolest guy. No, can't be just that, right? There is a lot that was not working, as it was absolutely normal for any society of that kind. It's still in our own, in every society, but still pre-industrial times, really the plague is that there is no such thing like a real centralized authority. And that coercive power has its own concrete limits, and when you have to make work something so big, like the Byzantine Empire was at the time, at a certain point you will lose control, or at least you have to facilitate certain changes in ways that you can't really oppose. But anyhow, for now we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.